Let's talk about Russia. Russia, Russia, Russia. Some interesting things that are going on, to say the least. And they can be very confusing to get a grasp on and understand exactly what on earth is going on here. So let's break a few things down that the media is not telling you about. We'll start off with the macro look at what's happening today in Russia, Ukraine. This is, at a macro level, about two regions in the southeast of Ukraine that are on Russia's border that are called the DPR and the LPR. Some countries are calling them the DNR and the LNR. And these are like large counties of an American state. They're fairly large areas, and they declared independence via a vote 8 years ago. And ever since, the Ukraine military has been attacking these people. So far, in the last 8 years, they've killed 14,000 people, and the world has completely ignored it. Why? So we'll come back to that in just a second. But a few days ago, maybe a week ago now, these two regions, the DPR and the LPR, under constant bombing from Ukraine, people dying, went to Moscow and sat down with Vladimir Putin and said, would you recognize our sovereignty, which we voted on 8 years ago? And Putin said yes. And Putin also said he would militarily protect them from Ukraine's military. This was signed by Putin. It was then ratified by Russia. It was ratified by the DPR and the LPR. So all three parties all ratified it with their governing bodies. Okay? What happened? Ukraine didn't take it seriously in the slightest, and they continued their bombing of the LPR and DPR regions. 2 more people were killed, and Russia, fulfilling their end of the bargain, of the agreement, said, we're going to send in peacekeepers. And they sent in peacekeepers, and the bombing raids continued. And Putin said, we're going to get into Ukraine and put a stop to this. Now let's go back. If we go back to when this current government was initially installed, it was installed with the help of the Obama administration. Now, I've talked about how Nazis, literal, biological, and ideological descendants of the Third Reich in Germany, did not lose the war, and that they have been spreading throughout all the countries of the world. They came here to the United States through Operation Paperclip. Officially 1,600, I'm sure it was significantly more. And they started subverting nations from within. They are the globalists. They are the European Union. They are the Democrat majority in the United States, some Republicans too. And they have been taking over the world. Now, you may think, oh, that's a little bit ridiculous. If you would go and listen to the podcast that I've repeatedly posted and pleaded with people to listen to, where I break this down in an hour and a half on a podcast, you can just Google Israel Anderson, the Fourth Reich, the rise of Rome. And I lay out information there you will not hear from any other person on the planet. This is information that I've arrived at through insight and intuition and observance. Since I published that podcast, many people have provided me with a lot of information that backs up my assertions in that podcast. But probably the most powerful piece of evidence that I'm right about that is now Putin himself. When he describes his reason for going into Ukraine, he talks about it being to rout Ukraine, the Ukrainian people, of the Nazis, and he's not using the word as some rhetorical device. He's being completely literal. To rout the Ukrainian people of their Nazi rule. Now, when I heard that, it was that was quite something. And obviously, you're not hearing this on the media anywhere. But I am telling you what is going on. See, people drop off. I see the counter going down. Look, there's very few people in the world that want to know what is actually real. The vast majority of people want their beliefs to be reinforced. The Bible talks about it, scratching itchy ears. Oh, I like that. Yeah, just keep going. Oh, I needed that. Right? It's like when you scratch a dog's ear and they're almost having an orgasm. I am fierce about truth and reality. I don't care. How about you give some thumbs up or some engagement here so we can get a few more people in here right now. I'm fierce about reality. Arriving at what is true is excruciatingly difficult. It takes time. It takes letting go of your own beliefs. If you can't recognize, if you can't see, visualize, you can't hold your beliefs in your hand and drop them onto the floor and let them go, you will never learn what the truth is because your beliefs will always override it. It's excruciatingly difficult to arrive at the truth. Let's go back a little further in history. Let's look at World War II. Hitler was instituting the Third Reich. And we all know about the Third Reich. It's a common phrase. You know it, and everybody knows it. People use it. The left uses it, calling the right the Third Reich all the time, always calling people on the right Nazis. I'm not on the right. I'm not on the left. I'm a nothing. I'm just an observer. Well, what's interesting is that we don't even think about, when we say the Third Reich, what's the Second Reich? And what's the First Reich? What are these things all about? Did we not even think to ask? You see, I'm a curious person. If you tell me it's the third of something, well, I want to know what's the first and the second. The Second Reich, Reich means realm or empire or rule. The Second Reich was the previous German Republic before Hitler took over and instituted his Third Reich. All right? What was the First Reich? I bet you don't know, unless you've been listening to me before. And you can fact check this, and you'll even find the correct answer sitting right there on Wikipedia, of all places. You'll find it all over the place, but it's not commonly known. This is going to surprise you. The First Reich was the Roman Empire. There you think, what? What's that got to do with Nazi Germany? Everything. Everything. The Roman Empire never went away. The Roman Empire still rules this world to this day. The majority of the planet, not all of it. And the one country they have the least amount of control in today, they had more control during the Soviet Union era, is Russia. They have almost no control. Putin has spent his time ruling Russia to get rid of the Nazis that came into Russia. They had their own version of Operation Paperclip. I have the name in my notes. It's in Russian. Don't expect me to pronounce it. But they had their own Operation Paperclip, where they brought in these literal bona fide Nazis into Russia. Now, people get all excited about the Nuremberg trials. I see people saying, we need new Nuremberg trials. The Nuremberg trials were just show trials. The real perpetrators were all let off. They were distributed all around the world. There was even some that were brought to the United States whose names came up on the warrant lists to be tried at Nuremberg, who were erased from that list because of American influence saying, oh, we want these people, so strike them off the list. We're not going to try these people at Nuremberg. This was the biggest strategic mistake that probably the world has ever made. This is akin to the Trojan horse at Troy. We brought in these bona fide Nazis and we gave them positions of power. We see Wernher von Braun at NASA. I got a notification here. Let me just put in science, technology, government, education, we put all of these Nazis into the United States, and so did other nations around the world. They spent their time regrouping. They achieved massive amounts of power. They formed the European Union. They took over what is effectively NATO. They took over the United States government through the Democrat Party. They took over the CIA. They became what we call today in America as the deep state. Nazis, the biological and ideological descendants of those that came over through Operation Paperclip, are the deep state. When Barack Obama was president, they overthrew the Ukrainian government and replaced that government and turned the country into a deep state vassal. Ukraine isn't really a country. It will be in a week. Ukraine is a territory being used by the Fourth Reich, this new rise of the Nazis, as one of their headquarters for global domination. Why? Because they want Russia. When we defeated the Nazis in that war, of course, in that battle, World War II, but we didn't really win the war. We won a battle, but they are winning the war. This is asymmetric warfare. This is a new type of war. This is an information war that the Nazis are waging. But when we won over there militarily, we found their generals' journals, and we saw all of their battle plans, and they were going to march on Leningrad, and they were going to take over the entirety of Russia, and they didn't want to be an occupying force. They wanted to destroy and kill every man, woman, and child in Russia. They didn't want any Russians to be left alive. And they still want Russia. And that's why they took over the Ukraine, because it's the largest country on Russia's southern border. It is the best way to invade Russia. And Putin knows this. Now, there's also a lot of chatter right now. It's hard to verify some of this information. There's a lot of chatter about the bio labs that are in Ukraine that all have connections to Anthony Fauci, Bill Gates, George Soros. And George Soros just came out a little while ago with a whole bunch of tweets about how Ukraine is our darling. Well, Ukraine has, George Soros has had an awful lot to do with Ukraine. And of course, we know about the corruption with the Bidens, both Joe Biden and Hunter Biden. So President Zelensky of Ukraine is a puppet. He's a puppet of the deep state. And the goal here was to turn it into a NATO nation so that they could enact Article 5 and go to war against Russia if Russia did anything to Ukraine. Are you starting to see a bigger picture now? When Putin says that he's trying to rout the Nazis from ruling over the Ukrainian people, remember Kiev or Kyiv, however you want to pronounce it, one is Ukrainian, one is Russian, is the birthplace of Russia. Almost all of Ukrainians speak Russian, and they certainly all have a paternal affinity with Russia. There are some areas like the DPR and LPR we talked about in the beginning that speak almost only Russian. So this block of land has been fought over and changed hands a few times over the last couple of 100 years, but it's a strategic stronghold. Why did Putin annex Crimea and Sevastopol? That used to be the largest naval port for the former Soviet Union. That was their stronghold. That was their beachhead. And so Putin felt the need to take it back. It's a very, very strategic piece of land. So whose side should we be on here? We should be on the kingdom's side, of course, always. But is Putin in the wrong here with what he's doing? Well, you can look at it like this. Are innocent civilians going to die in this incursion? Yes. There's no doubt about that, and nobody's interested in that. Nobody wants that. That's a bad thing. But this Ukrainian military has been killing thousands of people, 14,000 people over the last 8 years in the DPR and LPR regions. How many deaths is this incursion going to stop? Putin has no interest in occupying Ukraine. Putin wants to free Ukraine from the deep state Nazi installed government. It's not a democracy there. The United States deep state installed their government. Do you understand? It's not a democracy. And Putin is trying to rout those people that are basically holding the Ukrainian people hostage and set them free. And that's not being hyperbolic. There's no intention of occupying Ukraine. Now, obviously, for a week or a month, there will be some level of occupation, but that's not what anyone means by occupation. We mean that it becomes a state of Russia. That's not going to happen. These people will be removed, and free and fair democratic elections will be held in Ukraine, and they will elect their own leader. And they will provide one thing to Putin that he is demanding as a zero compromise factor in all of this. Ukraine never becomes a member of NATO. Because if they become a member of NATO, then all of a sudden, right along Russia's southern border, sits all of these NATO weaponry, including nuclear arms, including defense, missile defense systems. That's a line Putin refuses to cross. So how many people are going to die in this incursion? Probably a few hundred. And although in the scale of a small war, that's not actually that many people at all, it's still not a healthy thing. No one wants that at all. But I tell you what, it's going to save an awful lot of lives in the long run, because the Ukrainian bombing of the DPR and the LPR regions will stop, and people will stop dying. So, you know. Now, let's project this into the future a little bit. I would say to you, based upon what's going on right now, yeah, somebody said here, isn't it interesting to consider that Zelensky is an actor after all? He's not just an actor. You won't believe this if you haven't heard it. President Zelensky of the Ukraine, not just an actor, but played a role in a show for TV where he was the president of Ukraine. I kid you not. Propaganda. Okay, so let's project this into the future a little bit. Here's how I think we're going to see things play out. Ukraine has about 72 hours to surrender. I think that's most likely to happen. If Ukraine does not surrender, then there is an increasing likelihood that this is going to escalate. What does escalation mean in this situation? Escalation most likely means that Putin will attack a NATO country that is bringing in arms that will probably destroy the convoys of military equipment that is being driven into Ukraine. Now, maybe he'll do that just once they cross the border into Ukraine. But it will be interesting what these NATO nations do in response when he does that, and he will do that. I mean, Putin will destroy these convoys of goods. So you've got Germany, Poland, Britain, that are all sending arms into Ukraine so the Ukrainian military can use them against Russia. I'm not really sure how that's going to work right now because, you know, Russia is way ahead. But what happens if Germany brings in a convoy of military equipment and Putin destroys it after it crosses the border, even if it's fully within the Ukraine? How's Germany going to respond to that? Germans are going to be killed on Ukrainian soil, right? The potential for NATO to get involved in this conflict and for us to have a NATO versus Russia conflict is only increasing every hour. At this present time, I would say the chances of this are not dramatically high, but it creeps higher every hour. And what happens if we do end up in a conflict with NATO and Russia? Who would win in a kinetic war between Russia and NATO? NATO would win. NATO has far more military equipment, far more soldiers, far more people to fight than what Russia does. In a non-nuclear war between NATO and Russia, I don't see how Russia could possibly prevail. Well, that's a problem, and I'll tell you why. Some Americans don't like to hear that Russia has the most advanced military equipment in the world. They don't have the number of units in their military when you compare them to the United States and to NATO. Okay? They are massively outgunned. But the equipment they do have is definitely of a superior nature. Their hypersonic nuclear missiles can land nuclear warheads on US soil unhindered. I don't think there's anything the United States can do to stop them. They might take a few out, but the vast majority are going to hit the ground. The problem is the reverse is not true. The S-500 missile defense system that Russia has, which is so mature, they started off with the S-100, then the S-200, S-300, S-400, S-400 Plus, and now S-500. The S-500 missile defense system is the only missile defense system in the world that can take out a hypersonic nuclear missile. Will Russia take this nuclear? There is no question whatsoever. Putin will first strike the United States. I don't have any doubt about that. I just bought a gas mask today with radiation filters because I think this risk is quite real. Quite real. Cost me close to $500, by the way. They're not cheap. I don't have a lot of money. But if things are going to go south like that, that thing's going to save your life. If Putin is backed into a corner where he knows he cannot win through traditional non-nuclear warfare, which will be the position he's in if NATO chooses to go to war against him, he cannot fight back a NATO invasion of Russia. And he knows that. And that's why he's already threatened the rest of the world. He has said, do not interfere or you will see consequences never seen before. He will use nuclear weapons. He has the most advanced nuclear weapons in the world, and he has the most nuclear weapons in the world by far. In a nuclear war, Russia is likely to be the victor. Unfortunately, we will all be the losers, including Russia, of course. Other nations are going to fire nuclear weapons at Russia. They will take, I would say, the majority of them out, but some are still going to get through. All nations are going to be impacted. The whole world is going to be impacted. It's going to be total devastation. About a month ago, 5, maybe 6 weeks ago, a Russian military spokesperson said that if Russia is attacked, they will not respond to the origin of the attack. In other words, if somebody fires a missile into Russia, they will not respond and take out where that missile was launched from. Rather, they will take out the power structures that are enabling that to happen, that are behind the attack. And then he listed off a bunch of American cities, Washington, D.C., Los Angeles, New York City. He said, we will attack those centers rather than where the missiles came from. Does he have the capability to do that? Oh, you betcha he does. And I don't think there's anything the United States can do to stop it. I don't think there is. So we just have to wait and see what happens now. Will it escalate into a nuclear war? If people, when you talk about it, are saying to stop being silly, they're naive. We absolutely are on the cusp of nuclear war. More than at any other point in history. And the bombs, the nuclear bombs that we have today, the nuclear missiles, make Nagasaki and Hiroshima look like firecrackers. Their yield is 100, even 1,000 times larger than the bombs that America dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. You know, one of these missiles, just one warhead, hitting downtown Los Angeles will obliterate, like a 5-mile radius from ground zero. It's not going to be pretty. So be prepared as you can. I live in the middle of nowhere.